Welcome to this Mo conference as part of the two-day Forward Fest that is organized by 11-11-11 and that looks into the current challenges of international solidarity and the future opportunities or the paths forward. So we're happy that we are able to be part of that two-day festival and that so many of you have registered to be with us tonight and to attend a conference with 5 international high-level speakers. And I can't express enough how happy and how proud I am that we got all of them together. And it's something that maybe we should talk about later this evening. The fact that we're having 5 female top speakers, is it a coincidence? Is it central to the future of international solidarity? I'll leave that up to the debate later on tonight. Important is that we look at the challenges from 2 angles tonight. One is the shifting sense of geopolitical relations. And we know that, that there are many things happening the past 10 years that make our world different from what we knew before. We will look at that with Shada Islam and with Annelies Verstichel later on. And at the other end of the debate, we will look at the future of development within this changing world, and not just a changing geopolitical world, but a world with new urgencies and new challenges. And we'll start that debate with Ulrika Modeer immediately, and then close it off later this evening with Lata Narayana Swami from the University of Leeds. But first, let me introduce you to our first speaker of the night, Ulrika Modeer. Ulrika, thank you very much for joining us from New York. Ulrika Modeer is UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP. And UNDP, for those of you who don't know all the letter alphabets of the international world, is the UN Development Program, the best development platform that the United Nations has created. And she's assistant administrator there and director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy. Ulrika was in politics in Sweden before. She was State Secretary for International Development and Climate Action, I think. Before that, she was active, as most of you attending the conference, in non-governmental work, and among others, she worked for Diaconia, and she worked in places like Bolivia, Guatemala, Mozambique, Southern Africa. So she knows the grassroots work. She knows the policy level of national governments. And now she's looking at it from the multilateral perspective of UNDP. Ulrika, I'll give you the floor for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy, and also thank you for the possibility. And it's great that you spend the evening thinking about the future of development. It's incredibly timely, and I would also like to say that Belgium, of course, has a really important role as a country in the support that you're giving to the United Nations and our development programs across the world. And the core support, the long-term conditions that Belgium has given to the UN has made it possible for us to plan strategically, but also now in these times to act quickly to respond to the crisis. I had the opportunity actually yesterday to speak to your new permanent representative, the so-called UN ambassador in New York, and also given that you have a government in place now and lining out the priorities, we are really excited also to see how they come together with regard to important topics, with regard to prevention, but also climate action, gender equality, and many other things that we will work on together with Belgium. But then also with a wide range of actors, because we are celebrating UN 75, and I used to remind myself about the charter saying it's we the peoples. 5 years ago, we had the Paris Accord, we had the important decision on the Sustainable Development Goals, and world leaders then decided that they had to invite the broad range of actors. We need a science-based decision-making across the world. We need to work with academia, but also then with civil society and the private sector. Now, so a few words with regard to the future of development. And I think all of us are fully aware how the pandemic has condensed the experience of a slow and cumulative 80-year climate crisis into what can be called perhaps an 18-month health emergency, but also then revealing to the full extent our human vulnerabilities. And just like climate change, no one is, as we know, truly protected from the spread of the virus. And it has, we should know also and think about the potential to shift incentives, to act in ways that were not on the policy, legal and regulatory table before. But in order for us to make that substantial shift, and I will speak to that, we need to work together and think this through in the midst of the crisis. Because as we scan the horizon, we sense the human vulnerability that has been revealed on a global scale, magnified by pre-existing inequalities, something that UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, focus on a lot. And we believe that this is only a glimpse of the future, multiplied many times over by the ongoing climate crisis and also biodiversity crisis. And the intersection between vulnerability, increasing inequalities between, but also within countries, and unsustainability will define the future course of development. And our ability to turn this around and move beyond recovery towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement is really at stake now. So maybe we should ask ourselves if the convergence narrative of development of the past 30 years run its course. The great convergence, the great escape, getting better, the rise of the South, have all illustrated the power of a particular concept of development, namely that the technology catch-up, the global trade, and the exponential power of income growth can drive progress, reducing inequalities with the trickling down effects between countries and leading them up to a point of convergence. Well, in this view, development is about climbing a ladder and kind of holding up to the highest rung possible. But what if, and I think many of us nowadays ask this question, development is not about climbing a ladder at all. In our Human Development Report, and I would really like to invite you to have a look at it. It was launched in December last year, and this year we will launch the 2020 report that will also be incredibly interesting. We take note of the remarkable improvements in well-being that we have celebrated along the past decades. But we also zoom into some critical insights, and that is that the very dynamics that drove the improvements also drove increasing inequalities, as I mentioned. They drove unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, and gender inequality and violence in a way that we need to recognize. Now, in most countries, convergence in one dimension of well-being includes divergence in others, and this churning process leaves millions behind, as we need to see in the digital economy, and this is also what the report shows. The race for never and better skills, better health, is something that we have seen, but any future cycle of well-being will need to redress the legacies, and looking then at with a higher ambition, delivering well-being, we also need to see that we decouple this from CO2 emissions, and that we protect nature, and that we are ready for more climate and pandemic shocks as this century unfolds. Choices made today can have ripple effects long into the future, as we know, and some of these effects will be large enough to shift the course of fiscal, financial, institutional, and political constraints. Constraints that had kept the SDG agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, off track even, and we should recognize this, prior to the pandemic. These small shifts that lead to larger shifts can be characterized as tipping points that have the potential of reshaping trajectories of development over the long run. United Nations Development Programme has launched an online consultation to discuss the future of development. And I will see to that you get the link and get the possibility also to follow these discussions, because we have invited a wide range of actors and partners. And I think there are some really interesting discussions taking place on that platform. Now, as I referred to, with the adaptation of the 2030 agenda, the 193 member states of United Nations pledged to ensure that we would not leave anyone behind, and that we would really see to that we reach the furthest behind first. In practice, this means taking explicit action to end extreme poverty, as we know, curb inequalities and confront discrimination and fast-track progress for the furthest behind. 2020, this very year, was supposed to be the starting point of a decade of action and delivery, giving us a platform to boost commitments and resources for the difficult race towards the 2030 goals. However, as highlighted by the General Assembly President, the decade of action has become a decade of recovery. But at UNDP, we say that we need to move beyond recovery and really believe, as I've said, that we can shift the incentives, taking this crisis as an opportunity to see how to reach both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreements, because they are not less relevant, they are even more relevant today. Because the devastating impact of COVID-19 can actually be attributed to past and present failures taking the Sustainable Development Goals seriously. We have not addressed inequalities. We have not invested enough in resilience. We have not enough put women and girls at the center of development. And we have not heeded the warnings about the damage to the natural environment. We have been speaking a lot about the climate change, but we have certainly not done enough. And we also then, as you're going to speak today about changing geopolitics, not done enough to see to that we safeguard a rules-based world order and the United Nations. With the current crisis, which goes much beyond the health dimension, as we know, or the humanitarian dimension, the world risks losing even hard-won improvements towards the sustainable development. In our latest human development report that I referred to, you can see that overall we see that actually 6 years of human development gains are already lost. And if we look at the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking possibly about decades. This is the first time since we started to measure what we call human development that we are moving backwards and not forwards. And then we can look at what happened in 2008 and 2009 during the financial crisis. That was just kind of a major hiccup in the system. We believe that women's participation in all areas of society is essential. This is also a year where we should not only look at how to take us beyond recovery, but towards the Sustainable Development Goals and recreate that decade of action, but also a year to look at the importance of gender equality, as you know. And this is, of course, an area where we have seen a lot of engagement on behalf of Belgium and also the EU. Inequality between women, yeah, we have seen a lot of development, but at the current rate, we will have to wait another 84 years at global level if we are to look at equal pay between men and women. Climate change, once again, is affecting, as we know, rich and poor countries alike, but as we also know, it's a matter of deep injustice. The fact that the least developed countries that have contributed the least to the problem are the ones that are hit the most severe. It's happening as we speak, and we really need to see how to bring both climate change and biodiversity into the center of countries' recovery plans and the discussions, and we have the opportunity to do so. I think here again, Europe has an incredibly important role to lead and to take the lead as we have this geopolitical divide between both the US and China, and show the way together with partners, not least on the African continent, forward in this regard, putting nature and environment, putting climate change at the heart of development. The UN 75 celebration have given us the possibility to speak about these important topics, to speak about the importance of partnerships, of coming together, reminding ourselves about the important commitments world leaders made 5 years ago. I think they also speak to a number of important issues I haven't mentioned, the importance, of course, of robust universal healthcare systems, social protection systems, but also how we can shift some of the investments now, let's say, going into fossil fuel subsidies, into investments in people, looking at planet and people together. And I do think that we will see much more of the discussion also how important it is actually to address increasing inequalities and the way people also feel that the world is not fair and just, also with the promise of a more green future. We need to look at increasing inequalities and greening the offer of the future plans together. Otherwise, we will not get the support from countries. And as we speak, in the midst of the crisis, United Nations Development Programme is actually supporting 140 countries, among them some of the high emitters, to improve their actions and ambitions in their national determined contributions through the Paris Agreement, but then looking at this from a development perspective, also looking at inequalities and combating poverty. Well, finally, because I think my 10 minutes are gone and we should have a dialogue, just to say that it's incredibly important to safeguard the space for dialogue as we are having now, but to safeguard this space at a global level. We know that the very idea of multilateral cooperation is questioned by member states. And I think that to use this space, to use it as civil society, to come forward and be part of the solution and the dialogue with regard to future of development is incredibly important. So you always have the invitation on behalf of UNDP, but also by colleagues in the development system to be part of that discussion. And together we can make these discussions also become reality on the ground if we connect also our actions on the ground. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ulrika, for this broad spectrum that you draw and the number of important issues that you raise in your introductory remarks. Let me ask you a difficult question immediately. When the way that you describe the challenges, I wouldn't call them necessarily failures, but at least shortcomings in a sense of the development work that has been going on for 60 or more years in terms of not or even increasing inequalities and all of that. Wouldn't it be better to say that UNDP takes as its main mission to work for a just transition on a world scale that would comprise both justice, fighting inequality, and looking at it from the spectrum or from the perspective of climate change? How do you see that as the main mission for UNDP or for anybody involved in development work today?
No, I really think it is our main mission. And actually, as we have also decided how to prove the relevance of UNDP, we have been speaking about the importance of looking at increasing inequalities between, but also within countries, and the green, sustainable future, how we need them to come together. And you will see much more of this also as we're planning for some really important advocacy campaigns onwards, where we would very much like to also work very closely with civil society. I had a call together with the WWF today also, because also I think from the environmental organization side, they also see the importance to look at inequalities and how to get countries and people to come along in what we need to do to address the future.
One of the things that that sort of was encapsulated in the idea that development was climbing a ladder was also the necessity for growth. We needed growth in order to get a better redistribution. Then we got growth and didn't invest in redistribution. Now the question for the future is, can we have redistribution without necessarily investing in growth, or at least not in the fossil-driven growth that we've had today? Are there any ways forward on that field?
Well, I think what I mentioned very quickly in my overview also for us as the UN, based on solid thinking and research also to provide guidance to countries. And I mentioned the idea of also guiding countries to decrease also their funding of fossil fuel subsidies and then invest in programs that would actually make people come along. We know how difficult it is for governments also to take away subsidies with regard to fossil fuels, and what kind of uncertainty and also social conflicts that can create in a society. But if we find ways also to support and guide countries to do investments in a way that makes people understand that we're actually investing in them, we're investing in decreased inequality and those furthest left behind, I think that we can actually make this happen. And we have seen it happening, and we have some really good examples. So in a report that we issued perhaps was it 6 weeks ago, we actually suggested that we were to look at the fiscal space with regard to the debt situation that I didn't mention this much now today, but also the fossil fuel subsidies, and see if we could also guide countries with regard to investment in social protection systems and a temporary basic income. That was kind of the heading of the report, but it can also be other social protection measures.
When we talk about investment, we also touch finance, of course, and a lot of the development work in the past decades has been funded, financed by aid and or international cooperation, whatever you call it. That has never gotten to the level that was promised 70 or 50 years ago, the 0.7 for OECD countries. The question also is, what is the way forward? There is a lot of debate about aid. There's far less debate on tax revenue, which basically could provide for more investment in the global south than aid could ever do. So is the world making progress on that, or are we stuck in some middle where we don't know how to get out of it?
No, so I think you're all aware of that the Sustainable Development Goal decision was also accompanied by an agenda for financing for development. And I think that there are a lot of interesting things happening on that platform that we should have a closer look at, how we can leverage also the investments through ODA into development finance in different ways. UNDP has this finance sector hub where we have kind of drawn into our global toolbox also some really interesting tools with regard to investment
Ulrika,
for development.
If you allow me to come in on that, because what I've seen since Addis Ababa, where the finance for development was debated and shaped in a sense for the SDG era, is that a lot of attention and time has gone into trying to move private capital towards investment in development. Not much has actually come out of that. Very little has moved, even though it was also mentioned in Addis, in getting rid of tax havens and getting away from this tax evasion.
Yeah, and I can agree with you, because I think that we have interesting initiatives also with investors for sustainable development and so on. But we know, as you say, that very few of these investments are actually taking place in the least developed countries. And of course, then now with the situation we have with the pandemic, even less so. So foreign direct investments have gone down with 40% and remittances with at least 20%. So this is a very serious situation also, where I think we have to be upfront and also say that we need to defend ODA and defend also traditional development cooperation right now. And I think that's a really important task also that civil society, not least in Europe, has to take on and also explain to decision makers that while we do see the broader agenda for development finance and that traditional aid has become perhaps less of a portion of the overall funding, there is a lack of investment in the least developed countries, and it will be even more so now with the situation we have with the ongoing socioeconomic crisis for many, many years to come. Now, having said that, I do think that there are some interesting findings. There is a lot of cooperation on tax, as you mentioned. So UNDP works very closely with the OECD initiative on tax inspectors without borders. There need to be more discussions, I think, about tax and capital flight. I know that maybe you and other civil society organizations have been on top of that. I think we need to continue that discussion. We're having that very much also with our colleagues on the African continent, and the need also to revisit that agenda also from a UN perspective. And also see if we can also push our colleagues in the OECD to go beyond the BEPS process and really be more bold in that agenda. The debt crisis, as we mentioned, we know that it's so much more complicated than it was some years ago, also with the structure and what it looks like. And it's also very much part of the geopolitical discussion. So that also needs, I think, some attention on behalf of all of us. And of course, this week during the World Bank meeting, the IMF meeting, we have also put forward and will put forward some new ideas, as we did on behalf of the UN during the spring meeting. And there, I think actually that the UN is more bold perhaps than our colleagues in the World Bank and IMF, and that we could also do some joint ventures there with global civil society actors and civil society actors. But also just to come to your question, I think we have some interesting examples where we can drive also investments. UNDP has an initiative called Sdg Impact. It's the first initiative on behalf of the UN to really get a grip of SDG aligned investments. And we are then using the UN system to do the mapping at country level and really showcase investors that there is an investment case in a country in line with the SDGs. So I also invite you to follow up.
And in line with the Paris Agreement and everything that needs to be done to cut emissions. Just to close off and to stay on Paris and the environment, you already mentioned the Human Development Report, which I consider as the best thing ever done by UNDP, because it provides us with a yearly report with very in-depth analysis and facts and figures. I saw that this year's will be on human development and the Anthropocene, expanding human freedoms in balance with the planet, I think, with the planet. So I know that you cannot give us a preview, but still, what would we expect as one of the, maybe one or two important things that you think will be in the report?
Yeah, so already last year, I mentioned very quickly in my introduction, we zoomed in on the drivers of increasing inequality, digital and climate. This year, we're actually introducing a new index looking at the aspects of both environment and climate change in relation to human development. So I think it's going to be really exciting and turn some of the discussions around in an interesting way. So I really hope that you will make good use. We can't yet because the index is not there yet, but I do think that it's going to be an eye-opener and be an important platform for the discussions that we need to have when we look at human development and environment and climate change. Yeah.
Because we've been looking at human development and climate for a number of years, and so there's a number of basic assumptions that are there. It's not the poor that emit, it's they suffer, there will be migration. Are we going beyond those things that we already know? Are we expecting new insights?
Well, I believe, as you said, that the Human Development Report has created a lot of important discussions at country level. And I think for us and for colleagues in the UN system, but also beyond the broad range of partners, it will give us the possibility, as we also now work very closely with governments to see, as I mentioned, how can we get the national determined contributions, also these plans, to be much more at the center of planning, at the center of budget planning. How can we get the budgets to be, we're working with integrated national financial frameworks to see if we can support countries to plan in line with both then the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think the report will most likely be an important tool. I mean, not even in European countries, governments are really using the SDGs and the Paris Agreement to plan their budgets, as we know. So what's also important with the Human Development Report is that it covers all member states. And I think it will also provide some interesting insights also for European countries with regard to planning.
And what's the mood at the UN in terms of, and then we can move forward after that to the geopolitical changes, but we know that even for climate change and the Paris Agreement, there's some backtracking right now. Places like Brazil are not maybe formally, but in fact ditching the accord. Trump is trying to get out of it. So is the future open for this new approach, or are we trying to save whatever we can save?
No, I think that this world needs leadership, and this is also why I'm saying, and I really mean it, and the Secretary General, I think, has said also a number of times, Europe has an incredibly important role to create alliances with countries. We know that the African countries, also when we speak to them in the board setting of UNDP, puts both climate change and environment at the heart of the discussions. So I think Europe also leading the way also with the Green New Deal and creating new alliances across the world is incredibly important. And the support from civil society also to really speak about the importance of a rules-based world order, and also point to the fact that we actually have ongoing negotiations planning also for COP in Glasgow, and also the Conference of the Parties of this Biodiversity Convention is a story about the UN that hasn't failed. I think too many times we kind of point at the failures of the Security Council, but the UN is actually still working. UNDP is still working in the midst of the crisis with 114 countries, some of them also some of the big emitters, on their more ambitious and actionable NDCs. And I think that this is a positive story that we have to tell, even though I'm quite concerned, I must say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ulrika. We agreed that you would join us until 8 o'clock Brussels time. I'm afraid it's 8 o'clock, so you'll have to run to your next meeting. But thank you very much for taking time to be with us this evening, for us at least. You have another half a day to go. But thank you very much, and keep up the good work in New York and around the world, I would say. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for inviting me, and don't hesitate to contact us if you believe that there's anything we can do together.
Okay, we'll return to you whenever necessary or possible. Okay, thanks. Then I will pass on the camera and the microphone to John van Dalen, our colleague at Mo Reduction. So if John can get his microphone and voila, and video on, then I will get out of the video, and John, Annelies, and Shada will take you to the shifting sands of the geopolitical world. John.
Hello, good evening. I hope the sound is okay, because I didn't have the opportunity to test it. Can you hear me? Yeah, yes, okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you. As he said, we would now, in half an hour, try to say something sensible about the geopolitical situation. I think all of us have, the last years, observed some changes. We have a US president who openly belittles international institutions, prefers competition to cooperation. We have an emerging Chinese superpower, which is also more and more aggressive in some fields. Remember the short brush on the Indian border. One wonders how the relationship between these two superpowers will evolve. You have Russia, which is punching above its geopolitical weight, regional powers, an international of nationalists, you could say. And so we are going to talk about the question whether all these evolutions really make us evolve from a rules-based, more stable international situation to a more chaotic situation. And we will talk about this with two ladies. First, we have Shada Islam. She's a thinker and analyst, mainly in Brussels, living, I think. Politico calls her one of the leading voices in the geopolitical debate in Brussels. And then we have Annelies Verstichel, who is a Belgian diplomat, who was, I think, the last year in the kitchen of the geopolitics, working in the Belgian office in New York, when our country was indeed member of the UN Security Council. I would like to start with this general question, to have a short answer from you, to know where you're coming from in this regard. So is there really a change from a more rules-based, predictable international order to a more chaotic, unstable situation? Yeah, and so what would be your answer on this, Shada?
So thank you very much, John, and thank you, Mo Magazine, for inviting me. So it does look very chaotic, and it does look very unpredictable at the moment, and COVID-19 isn't helping the situation. Of course, it's making us very nervous, and we are all living in very anxious times. But was the last bit of the world, the last few years of the world, were they so much better? What did we have? We had a Cold War, Now we're focused on US and China, but that Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was debilitating for the rest of the world. The rest of the world, there were proxy wars everywhere. We forget that there was conflict in many, many parts of the world, and countries across the world were being squeezed between these two superpowers. Now, who was setting the rules? It was a very West-centric order. They were rule makers, the Europeans, the Americans set the rules. With a couple of like-minded countries, maybe Canada came along, or once in a while Australia came along, but the rules were being set by a very small number of countries, and they were rule takers, and the rest of the world was just taking up those rules. It was rather an unfair order, and you only have to talk to countries in the developing world to say, look guys, you in the West may be looking back and saying, wow, that was a golden era. For us, it wasn't that fantastic. So, let's put things in proportion. So what happened, and why are we now sitting here in the West talking about chaos? Because other parts of the world now have agency, now have a voice, and now are demanding a say in how the world is run. The change started, John, really, and I'll be quite brief. The change started really when Japan in the 1980s became the first non-Western country to grab economic power, run with it, and became very strong from the economic point of view. I was a journalist in Brussels in those days, writing about how Europe was so worried about being taken over by the Japanese economic superpower. So we had the rise of Japan, then we had the rise of the tiger economies in Asia, and then, of course, we had the rise of China. And that is, of course, been the defining element of the last few years, which causes anxiety because suddenly we find ourselves also facing a very important, a very huge non-Western power, but also one that has an ideology and a state capitalist system, which is very different from us. So we have that. So that was already a change, right? Then, of course, Donald Trump arrives on the scene with America First, Make America Great Again. And the whole world is then, in the midst of a great power competition, zero-sum games. And it's all about winners and losers and rather nasty, I have to say. And then, of course, the world is changing also because of digital technology. Look at us, we can talk to everyone in the world. We have Twitter is there, Facebook, all of these things. So the world was already changing. And I think the world has never been really rules-based, stable, unpredictable. Yes, we had the multilateral system that has been fragilized by the sledgehammer that Donald Trump, the wrecking ball that he's brought in. But it was not the golden era. But final word, yes, newspapers, magazines are focused on everything that doesn't work. But if you look beyond today and into the deeper side of how the world is operating, cooperative order is not dead. You've seen this with COVID-19. Yes, there was an initial reaction of great tension and competition, but countries, not the United States under Trump, but countries have come together. Countries are working together on climate change as well. Not the United States, once again, but other countries are coming in. So there are changes happening, but it was inevitable. 70 years post Second World War of the same kind of rules applied by the West to the rest of the world, that had to change.
Okay, thank you. So Shada is saying, okay, change has happened, but it is not all that negative. Annelies, what would you say to the same question, or even reacting already to Shada?
Yes, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I feel very honored to be surrounded by these distinguished speakers. I liked very much what Shada said. I wanted to pick immediately up on what she said about that many parts of the world are demanding a voice agency, are claiming agency. And I can speak from first-hand experience. I spent 5 years in New York. I was part of the Security Council team of Belgium. Belgium is still in the Security Council until the end of this year. But before that, I represented Belgium in the General Assembly in the Third Committee on Human Rights. And well, to answer your question with regard to, has it become more power-based and predictable, confrontational? I have seen it changing. I mean, only in those 5 years already. Resolutions which in the General Assembly every year were used to be adopted by consensus, more and more a vote was asked and no consensus was found anymore. Another example in the Security Council. So when COVID-19, the pandemic, really took off in the spring, March, the Secretary General called for a global ceasefire. It took months for the Security Council to agree on a resolution on COVID-19 and to kind of endorse this call for a global ceasefire of the SDG. And the discussions were stuck between US and China. China wanted the mentioning of WHO in the resolution. Russia wanted to call the virus a Chinese virus, which China, of course, didn't like. But if you talk about broad brushes, I agree with Shada, with the Cold War, there was a certain type of stability, but not the stability that most part of the world liked, and they were squeezed in between big powers. I would say, so the Secretary General talks about a new Cold War. And some would say that the 90s and the years 2000 were a kind of interbellum. After the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of euphoria. Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history, etc. Yeah. And you could see on the multilateral system, a lot of treaties were adopted, a lot of mechanisms with strong mandates were adopted. Just to give an example, so the Working Group on Children and Conflict, so one of the subsidiary bodies of the Security Council, which Belgium is chairing, and I was in charge of our chairmanship when I was in New York. It's a strong mandate. It looks at, it's a mandate which looks at perpetrators of grave child rights violations, including state actors, and they're put on a blacklist every year in an annex of the SDG's report. I mean, in these days, it wouldn't be possible anymore to set up such a mandate. So I would say the 90s and the years 2000 were kind of interbellum, where everyone, even though we had the Balkan Wars, we had the wars in the Caucasus, Nagorno-Karabakh, etc. So there were a lot of ethnic wars, but it brought, all the states around the table were convinced we need to solve this in a multilateral way. Yeah. And that somehow, these strong mandates given to, for example, also the OSCE, High Commission on National Minorities, etc. All those mandates have much more difficulties now to kind of deal with all those conflicts.
And why is that so? Is that because of this basic tension between China and the US, or is it much more complex than that? Or
I mean, this basic tension between China and the US, it's only something of the last years. I would say that it's really, some would say it's a new bipolar order, but I would say the world is trying to find a new equilibrium. And in a certain way, it's healthy, like Shada said, like lots of countries in the world are asking for a voice, are asking for agency. And I've seen that, for example, in the General Assembly. I mean, you have the group of G77. So those are countries from the developing world. They're at the moment, so they were set up in the 60s. At the moment, there was 135 countries. If that group, which is quite strong at the UN in New York, if they coordinate and agree, they outvote the West and the Western countries, European countries. We are very much aware of that. And so it kind of forces us in a new relationship. And I would say this is healthy. But and like Shada also said, we have a US which is withdrawing itself from this multilateral system. We have Trump, which is predictable in his unpredictability. And the kind of vacuum that the US creates by withdrawing from international agreements, from international organizations. I mean, WHO is one thing which was announced. They still haven't withdrawn. That takes about a year, but UNESCO, UNRWA, the funding, the climate, the JCPOA, so the agreement with Iran, the nuclear deal with Iran. So withdrawing from all those agreements and organizations, it leaves a vacuum. And you have now China, which becomes more assertive. In the Security Council, it used to kind of hide behind the back of Russia, did not really vote, use its veto that much as Russia. Now it has no problem using its veto anymore. And so in that vacuum, there's like a new equilibrium which is being sought.
Yeah. So I understand from both of you that you say it's not so black and white. You have positive evolutions. The fact that more countries now have more agency, that is positive. But on the other hand, I think both of you say this tension between China and the US, the attitude of the US itself, creates new problems in a way. And you cannot describe the situation, which is normal, because the world is complex, with one sentence. It's becoming more predictable or less. You have positive evolution, but also negative evolutions. But from what I understood from both of you, is that Shada said the cooperative world is not dead, while I understood from you, Annelies, that you said, maybe it's not dead, but it's much more difficult now to get, for instance, certain resolutions or certain mandates in the UN. So is there a difference of opinion there between both of you, that you say that Shada is more optimistic when it comes to cooperation, while you observed, Annelies, in New York, that some things have really gotten more difficult? So Shada, what do you think about that?
Well, you see, the thing is, first of all, I really do think what you've said, John, is very important. So there is no one single narrative about what the world is looking like today. And one of the narratives we're getting, and really coming from the Trump view of the world, which is, really sinister and dark, where there are malign forces out there, the China of their imagination, which is even worse than the Russia of their imagination. So a bit of a Hollywoodian story of good and evil in a battle, I mean, that's such a simplistic version of the world, which is, as Annelies has said, such a complex and multifaceted situation. So this narrative is really undermining our world views. And it's being picked up, John, by journalists, by other policymakers. And before you know it, everyone makes it happen, and that polarization does exist, of course. And Annelies, I agree with you that for me, one of the most tragic things was that we didn't get that ceasefire. It was such an opportunity to make COVID-19 something that would be useful for world peace and bringing people together, and we didn't manage it. In fact, the United Nations Security Council was absent during the first few months of the pandemic. So I do agree with you there. But I have to say that the vacuum left by this so-called global policeman, which the US has played the role, if you like, has been taken up by others. Now, I remember very, very early on in the Trump administration, when he stopped or said he was going to stop giving money to family planning, to the UN family planning networks and agencies. And the Europeans immediately stepped in and said, well, we'll do it, Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the trade agreement between Asian countries, a very important part of the global trade networks. Japan said, I'll take the lead, and we will do it. There's been this whole chaos about vaccines and the World Health Organization, whether it's still credible, relevant. The Europeans said, we believe in it. Climate change, America is not part of the new conversations. Other countries are going ahead, and Xi Jinping, China, just announced a huge kind of step forward. So I do agree that within the United Nations framework, there's fighting over resolutions and that. But in the real world, where initiatives matter, people are forging bilateral partnerships, region-to-region agreements, intra-regional agreements. Africa has its now vast continental free trade area. And that's the kind of thing. And I'm not even going to talk about civil society and other things now, because we're talking states. But I see a lot of, I agree with you that there is indeed polarization and sometimes you don't get resolutions. But for me, the UN structure is one thing, and real life where people actually then say, look, I want to sell you protective equipment, PPEs and masks, what can you do? That kind of stuff is happening, and that the US cannot stop, they cannot.
Annelies, could you react to that outside the UN, there's a lot of other things going on?
Of course, and also in the UN, I always say optimism is a moral duty. I mean, the fact that only in 2015, it's only a couple of years ago, that all 193 countries around the world agreed on Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, that is very powerful, and that's the framework within which we work at the UN. So it might be more difficult, but it doesn't mean we cannot get to consensus anymore and agree anymore.
When it comes to the role of the EU, we are here in Brussels or in Belgium. So, of course, this is an interesting question. The EU being itself a form of structural cooperation. So what can be the role of the EU? What is actually the role of the EU in the current world? Annelies?
Oh, I get the floor first. Okay.
Well, we can.
Yeah. So the EU, at the UN, the EU tries to speak with one voice. And the positions on different topics are agreed in different council conclusions, and you have in Brussels lots of hours and hours going to agreeing on such a common position. The EU is spending lots of time on that. But you could see also at the UN, if the EU speaks with one voice in the General Assembly, you have, and I've been one of those negotiators. I represented, well, it was still before Brexit, 28 countries. Now it will be 27 countries. It's an important block. So what can the EU play? The EU has its values and its, human rights-based approach, the rule of law, even though that in some European countries, EU member states, the rule of law is under threat, let's point it like that. And those countries also kind of make it more difficult for the EU to speak with one voice at the UN. We saw that with the Global Compact on Migration, where Hungary, for example, did not join in the EU common position. It's a kind of approach or vision of the world which is not necessarily shared by others. For example, we spoke about China. It's very clear that China has a different vision of development and how the world should look like. And it's definitely not one where justice accountability is part of it, where human rights is part of it, where NGOs are part of it, human rights defenders. So you could see, if you talk about those texts at the UN, those are the first concepts which need to get out of the text. And so
and is that mainly because of China, or are there many so-called emerging or developing countries who question the values that the EU purports to defend?
Yeah, well, it's the EU, but I would also say the UN, and we just heard Ulrika Modeer from UNDP, Assistant Secretary General, and you could say like the UN is based on three broad pillars. You have peace and security, development, and you have human rights. And the former DSG of the UN, Jan Eliasson, also Swedish, he said, like, you cannot have peace and security without development. You cannot have development without peace and security, and you cannot have both if they're not based and grounded in human rights. So that is a vision on which the UN is based, the EU as well. China, for example, and they brought resolutions, for example, Human Rights Council, where they clearly put forward a vision of development that, development first and human rights comes later, or not necessarily that important.
But you have many human rights. You also have economic rights. The right to development is for them more important, they say. That's their discourse.
Yeah.
I'd like to go to Shada also because the time is running. How do you look at the role of Europe, the role it is playing, or the role it could be playing, and also how it is regarded by other blocs or countries? Yeah, Shada.
John, so I am a passionate believer in Europe. It is an experience, an experiment, an entity that inspires me. And also I have to say, although some people might attack, parts of the European Union, saying it can be protectionist, development aid hasn't always been, what it should be. Much of its policies towards Africa are still stuck in a post-colonial era. I think that the experiment, this experience, this story of Europe, this narrative of former enemies coming together, it doesn't just inspire me, but it inspires many countries. And you've seen ASEAN, you've seen Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Mercosur, others. They're trying to do the same thing in a different way, because it's not as ambitious, etc. So Europe matters, and Europe matters on the world stage. I think Charles Michel, the EU Council President, said something which is quite interesting recently. He said, Europe is big, but doesn't know it. And he meant not big in size, of course, though it is, population, size, market is big, but we still are, somebody said to me the other day, Europe is very humble. Europe is quite humble. I don't think Europe is humble, but Europe has been overly dependent on the United States, sort of lived under America's shadow.
You mean that it doesn't feel it hasn't found its geopolitical voice?
It's finding it now, John, which is why I'm really excited to be here in Brussels and be part of this conversation, because change is happening even as we speak. And there I have to say to you, and this may be very provocative and controversial, but I think Donald Trump has been good for Europe. He's been a wake-up call for Europe. He has forced Europe to stand on its own 2 feet and not to walk in America's shadow. And this is what the rest of the world likes, because Europe has its own personality, and I have to say, Annelies, its own values. We have values that are very special, and if we adhere to them, we can be even more powerful. But Europe is held back by, I would say, 3 things. First of all, in the world, as far as its perception of Europe goes. First of all, we have enormous inequalities in Europe, and we have to deal with those, whether it's between rich and poor, whether it's between men and women, whether it's between minorities, etc. So, and COVID-19 is going to make that even more sharp, Then we have to deal, and Annelies pointed to it, we have to deal with our populists, our racists, our bigots, our xenophobes, and our far-right parties. They're not just loony bins, on the sidelines. They're really powerful forces, and they are ruining Europe's narrative and story. And my final point would be on this, just one more word. We have to become strategic actors in our own region. And that means, we can talk about the great power rivalry and China and the rest of it, but we need friends and networks around. And for the moment, our neighborhood is on fire. Just one final point about one voice. I've been following the EU for very, very long, and I do not believe that we will have one voice on every single issue every single time. It's just not possible. We're different 27 countries. Let's live with it, and let's make that a power. So if Germany has a special relationship with China, what's wrong with that? As long as others don't suffer, and they don't. So there's nothing wrong with special relationships or having different points of view on Russia or whatever, as long as when it's important, we do act together.
Yeah.
If I can contribute to that, Borrell, which is a high representative for the EU, he talks about the Sinatra doctrine. I did it my way. So he says the EU should, as opposed to, should not choose sides, US, China, or other parts of the world. It should run its own course. And like Shara was saying, the issue of, strategic autonomy is very much debated at the moment on all different levels. Defense, I mean, if Trump would get reelected, you might even think, will he withdraw from NATO? So European defense, also on cloud, data, 5G.
So Annelies, you agree with Shada that Trump has been good for Europe in a way?
Well, it's the way she described it. For that reason, yes.
Yeah.
But it also means it's a traditional ally on the world stage, which, like the previous European president said to Trump, we're some of your best friends, but after all, you don't have that many. So it's it's a traditional ally, and because of the current administrations, so we'll have to see with the elections in November, and if Trump will get reelected, it will continue in that direction. But it's a traditional ally, which is not an ally anymore internationally on the World Forum.
Yeah. To finish our discussion, I would like to go to final question, and that is, in fact, what can be the role of non-governmental actors, and specifically the civil society, in these huge issues? Of course, we are talking about the big world now, but what has been your experience in that? Maybe Annelies, you can go on, and then we go to Shada.
I mean, what is definitely clear is that at the UN, we're speaking about a shrinking civil society space. There's less and less space for civil society to take part and to be allowed to be present at the debates at the UN. And China, for example, is one of those countries, but also many others who don't like critical voices. I mean, I think there's a huge importance for civil society. It's a democratic principle. They keep, state actors on their toes. They need to justify their positions. They have eye for topics and bring out reports which give good input into the debates which we have and can influence decision making. So I would say NGOs have an extremely important and civil society in general. So we also talk about academia, think tanks.
But your experience is that in the UN, at least, that the space they have is smaller, and I guess I go back to the same thing again, that is because, for instance, a country like China thinks that there should not be a too big space for free media or NGOs or whatever, non-governmental actors.
Yeah, I can give the example. So you have the NGO committee. So that's one of the committees under the ECOSOC, and they decide which NGOs get observer status, and get access to the UN to be part in all those meetings. We, with the European countries, we call it the anti-NGO committee, because the countries, so you have, like at the UN, you have 5 regional blocks, and they're represented in all the bureaus and all the different committees. And so the representatives, so you have, for example, a China, you have a Russia, you have a Cuba, you have, they block lots of countries, lots of NGOs. Those NGOs who get observer status are the ones who are small, insignificant. They're not controversial. They don't speak up so much, So,
do you have an example of an NGO that has been blocked because of it? An NGO that all of us know, or?
I should have have this prepared. Yeah. I have to think, but I mean, Belgium was before also in the NGO committee, and we tried to fight to get some NGOs based in Belgium observer status, and sometimes because they have been too critical of human rights violations in certain countries, through their proxies, those countries were blocked. Yeah, be it on human rights, but also be it, for example, on sexual reproductive health and rights. Those, NGOs working on LGBTI rights, for example. So yeah, it's very difficult for them to get access to the UN at the moment.
Shada?
Yeah, so the thing is, once again, you can't just say that it's the Chinas of this world or the Russias of this world. I mean, you have democracies like India throwing out NGOs. Amnesty just packed up and left. People are being, Saudi Arabia, big ally, right? Who has any civil society rights there, right? Media in trouble in our own European Union, Hungary, Poland, Malta. Yeah. I mean, so once again, I'm very, I don't know, maybe it's through my experience, but I'm very cautious about demonizing only one set of countries for breaking the rules. And even in our own societies, John, how often our civils, I mean, look at, all the NGOs helping migrants in the seas. They've been treated like criminals by the Italy, Greeces of this world. They've been taken to court. They've been called. So, we are living in a world where, and that's that's something that we should be aware of, that they're so complex. There are no good guys and bad guys. You know, it's the duality, competition, cooperation, duality is our new normal. And it's difficult for us to understand because since the day we were born, we were told there are heroes and villains. You know, but that narrative has been, you know, and that's why there's us and them. You know, we're good, they're bad. We're white, they're black, and so they're not. You know, this kind of duality, I think, is done. And a final point about civil society: without civil society, the current structure of the world would fall apart. They're the ones who are running the show behind the scenes. We look at states, but it's civil society networks, people's initiatives that have saved so many countries. This migration so-called crisis, how has it been handled? It's been handled by civil society, people, NGOs. So I am a great believer in them. And I think without them, this world would be a much darker place than it is already. And so bravo. And countries that don't want civil society actors and representatives, well, you know, that's really not going to work for their people because people need that humanity. And where does the humanity come from? So if you look at climate change, Greta Thunberg, but not just her, look at Black Lives Matter, people in this, look at #MeToo. All of these are people's initiatives that have rocked the world in a good sense, you know, made us aware. And it's not states who are doing it. So the UN can work with its states, but the real people engage with civil society, business, etc. Sorry, that's one of my passions, so I get very carried away with this.
Okay, that's very good to get carried away in this way. I've seen several interesting questions here passing on in the chat box, like, has the UN become obsolete? Many other questions, but I'm sorry, people, we only have half an hour, so it's impossible to pick up all these questions, but thank you for these suggestions. And I think we now have to go to the next part of our evening. I really want to thank Annelies and Shada for this interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, Shada, and Annelies, for indeed a very interesting conversation on geopolitics, going far beyond this traditional state approach of it. And I welcome our fourth speaker of the evening, Lata Narayanaswamy. Lata is a professor or a lecturer at Leeds University, and she is working there for the Center of Global Development, and that's what she's lecturing also. So we thought it would be good to bring the different lines together from the UNDP approach of development and what that could mean over the shifting sense of geopolitics into the question, where do we go from here? And Lata will help us look at that. Lata, we heard a lot of things already, and I'll ask you a little bit later what you would like to pick up from that. But maybe first, one thing that comes back again and again is inequality as one of the defining features of our world internationally, but also in societies, and as one of the things that blocks us from really developing into a human society. So is inequality tackled in a good and in a sufficient way by what we know as development work or development programs?
First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. What a privilege to be here amongst all of you. And thank you, all of you who have tuned in on a Thursday evening. So thank you for that. So in answer to your question, Guy, it's so important because if we sort of step back and look at the history of some of the academic literature talking about inequality, even in sort of 1967, when Dudley Sears was sort of trying to conceptualize what we might consider development, it was very much the sense that, well, actually, when when it was sort of a focus on, say, GDP growth or wealth creation in sort of an aggregate sense, he was very interested in saying, well, hang on a second, if, you know, economies are growing, but inequality is also growing, or people's, you know, basic needs or human needs are not being met, could we really call that development? So in that sense, what we've seen in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and reflecting very much a lot of the conversations that have happened thus far this evening, which I really appreciate, we're seeing that some of that geopolitics is then changing the ways in the places in which we might be seeing inequality growing and how that's manifesting in these different contexts. So one of the ways in which this has been reconceptualized in the last sort of 10, 15 years is to think about moving away from inequality and poverty being about countries to sort of seeing maybe the emergence of a transnational elite. And you're seeing poverty and inequality growing within countries, including places like India and China that are classed as middle or middle high income countries. So what I would want to do in terms of thinking about the sorts of conversations we've had so far is to step back and try to bring a systems level critique to why that might be the case. And in that sense, I feel like that's sort of the missing piece in our dialogue up to now, which is, why is it that we are actually getting really quite unimaginable forms and volumes of wealth creation, right? We are either, I don't know, I think it depends on who's counting and when, but, you know, we have our first trillionaire, right? And I believe that is Jeff Bezos, who, depending on the day, you know, is sort of worth $1 trillion. I mean, these are, you know, unimaginable amounts of money. And when you think about, and the ways in which people can make calculations about what it might mean if we even had a nominal level of redistribution towards a lot of the goals that we've discussed this evening, particularly Ulrika talking about really important things around, you know, putting climate at the center of those discussions. How do we bring countries into those conversations? How do we acknowledge that the burden of climate change is being borne disproportionately by the world's poorest, not necessarily poor countries, but poor groups of people, maybe within countries. So places like India, places like China, those countries that have large coastlines where we might be seeing creeping water levels and oceans that might be actually subsuming islands and countries en masse. So those are the people that are at the sharp end of this climate crisis, who had nothing to do with actually creating it in the first place. So when we try to work through why that might be, my aim in that is to then say, okay, but why does that inequality occur? Now, I think in some respects, particularly in lots of Western contexts, but it's really important to acknowledge the growth in social protection systems, quite diverse social protection systems in lots of what we might call the global South. So South Africa stands out as a really good example of a country that has really quite what we might call advanced or integrated social protection systems to respond to the challenges that they face within their country. And yet, we're still not so good at redistribution. And in the last 10 years, we are seeing the retrenchment of at least what we might call the Western welfare state, which is by no means homogenous. But we need to be starting to think about why the inequality exists. What are the levers that we might pull in order to address that? I agree as well with Shada in terms of thinking that actually it isn't just states that have to be in that conversation, but we need to have a much more holistic conversation and an honesty about the system that might be driving that growing inequality in the first place. So we can't just have wealth creation without redistribution, but there's a reason that that's a very difficult conversation to have. So whether that's about market societies, but
no, can you be explicit about it? Because I think it's a good challenge to say, or to ask the question, why is it that through all this economic growth or even development decades, we have not been able to get rid of inequality. Instead, we see growing inequalities around the world in different countries. So why is it? Can you name it?
Yeah, well, it's capitalism. And it's the fact that we are in a system, we prioritize either the establishment, the proliferation, the strengthening of market systems. Now, there is a debate to be had about the value of that. When you have growth as an underlying condition for what we might label as a kind of success. So in other words, there is a narrative where, you know, development is not possible without growth. Even in the West, which is supposed to be developed, you're still seeing that push for growth. It's one of the things in terms of the metrics that we're measuring the COVID crisis, and the way we've responded to that is the fact that we're countries that are moving into recession. And that's also being measured in relation to growth, and the suppression of that growth is seen as deeply problematic. So the fact that there is a global health pandemic and that we're not shopping or consuming as much, that then poses real material challenges for the way that we live. But if we look at those debates around, say, you know, so Ulrika's point about centering climate crisis, absolutely right. But if we're not honest about the fact that the systems that we've come to rely on absolutely depend on us growing and growing continuously, right? This isn't even about getting to a level of growth and then plateauing. That isn't what the system demands. The system demands that we continue to grow, we continue to consume. That has ecological consequences. So sort of saying that we need to sort of, you know, put the West at the forefront of those solutions to the climate crisis, that also has to be an inward-facing conversation. We have to ask ourselves about the sustainability of the way that we live. And I know there's lots of challenge around that, because that's a very difficult political conversation to have, and it doesn't tend to win you elections. So they're difficult conversations to have.
But if you turn it around then and you say we shouldn't look at the Western model as the way forward for everybody, then at the same time you criticize growth from a Western perspective. Can we also criticize growth in the global South? Because even within the Paris Agreement, there's agreement that at least the poorest countries need growth to get to a level where they can have sustainable human development.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important point, because I have a lot of sympathy with global South countries coming into these sorts of spaces like the Paris climate talks, and sort of saying to the West en masse, you know, it's really easy for you to come along and say that we have to have green growth, when you not only grew on the back of the extraction of minerals and coal and gas and slave labor and colonialism, and then to turn around and say, well, you know, you're all very wealthy, but now that pathway is not open to us. There is a sort of internal logic to that. But yes, in answer to your question, yes, the growth paradigm is problematic, particularly because we're seeing that actually pulling back from it has very substantial political consequences. As I said, it's a really difficult argument to win. But also, in a way, there is room for the global South to grow, in the sense of concerns around per capita emissions or extraction of resources. I suppose in that sort of technical measurement around CO2 emissions, it is you know, disproportionately, I mean, that isn't even a word that captures how much of that burden to bring down CO2 emissions really sits with the very wealthiest Western countries. So there is room to grow. The challenge becomes, though, at what point do you decide that that growth, if indeed it's about the extraction of coal or gas or other sorts of fossil fuels, at what point do you think, okay, well, actually, okay, in the global South, oh, we've grown up to this point and we've emitted this much CO2. Now we're going to stop and do something different. I don't know that would either be politically viable, but also even from an emissions point of view, I don't even know how that would work. But also, you know, if we don't then have a collective conversation, and I think one of the things I know you had said, you know, you were interested in sort of exploring is that question of solidarity. I think we need a new narrative then around how we work together on these questions in ways that don't minimize that challenge, but also puts the West and the West's responsibility to address these challenges at the heart of those discussions.
Yeah. The question then becomes, who is the we? Because if we need to have a conversation, then who are we? Is that 7 billion people? Is that the states? Is it civil society, as was said by Shada, for instance? How do we go about, and how do we connect, and who do we connect with if we want to develop this international solidarity in a future-proofed way?
Yeah, I mean, it is such an important question. I wouldn't want to discount the value of any one stakeholder in that process. For me, you know, if we're going to bring it back to the lens of sort of what is development, I personally would like to see us change the terms of that conversation. So if we were to really take up Ulrika's challenge, which I think actually, you know, if what she's describing is sort of the UNDP really trying to, you know, put climate at the center, you know, really shift that emphasis on growth, thinking about social protection, social development systems, actually, it would make sense then for us to think differently about what development means, right? Because if what we're saying is that sustainability actually requires a drop in CO2 emissions, for instance, then actually that makes all of the West developing countries, because actually you need to change how you live and work in order to, and exist, in order for those CO2 emissions targets and the drop in them to be met. And this is something that I would really favor, but also it is absolutely about building solidarity in order to shift that political conversation. So for me, I'm always aware that I have a relative privilege being an academic, being in academia, the freedom to speak my mind that gives me. But I feel like it's really important then. So being here today is a good example of where you can start a dialogue and a conversation with allies, people who might then help you to collectively raise your voices a little bit louder. We need to insert ourselves into those spaces to change the conversation. One of the things that's really interesting in this space is that people tend to think that actually it's really difficult to win hearts and minds. Actually, people are quite fixed in what they think. But if we actually reflect on, say, the last 100 years of human existence, is there anything about the world, the way we live now, including the fact that we are having this conversation across different countries online? I mean, I'm sitting in the UK in a completely different time zone. This would have been this was science fiction about 40 years ago. We just couldn't imagine it. So actually, our capacity to change and adapt, I think, is serially underestimated. So we have to build those conversations and solidarities and seek out those allies to help a change in our discourse and that conversation, because that's creating an opening for the political discourse to change. That's where the possibilities lie. But I think all of this, so Ulrika and Shada and Annalise really did highlight some of those challenges in terms of where the power in that discourse lies. You know, when Trump talks about the US pulling out of transnational agreements, that has material effects for people around the world. And then you have to work really hard to kind of get back the discursive terrain from the sorts of pronouncements that he makes. That isn't a simple challenge, and it's not a short-term one either.
Atta, maybe already closing question, but I would like to dig a little bit deeper into the we question that I posed, because one of the challenges that are on the table today in terms of international solidarity or solidarity movements is that people who are motivated are now sometimes torn apart by discussions on decolonization or identity politics, or I would not say that we should not have them. The question is, how can these necessary debates and conversations be had in a way that they strengthen solidarity rather than divide us further up?
Yeah, you know, this is such an important question. And I'm really glad you asked it, because I think, to go back to your point about this question of the we, I think we really have to be mindful of the terrain in which that question of we is being defined, right? So now we have the resurgence a kind of a far right that is sort of playing that kind of identity politics, that's trying to break people down into constituent groups, trying to set up sorts of grievance that is really not solidaristic at all. So for me, the challenge is, how do we have a dialogue across difference? The way in which some of that rhetoric gets picked up, and certainly a right-wing press. I mean, I'm in the UK at the moment, I find that's a particular challenge, where the mainstream media talking points tend to be framed on the terms of the right. It's almost as it's presented in a way as if those sorts of identities are insurmountable, right? As if I can't have solidarity with, so I'm heterosexual, then it becomes impossible for me to have solidarity or any alliance with people who are fighting for LGBTQ rights. But I think that's absolutely not the case. The whole point of solidarity is I can support you. We can work together for a collective cause, and I don't have to be like you to believe those things. So in a way, I think the we is just genuinely everybody. But in a way, I guess to answer your question, the starting point has to be challenging the othering that is so often happening in our discourse, that's preventing that solidarity from emerging, because we are actually being broken down into these sorts of really identity pockets, right? So now so in the case of the UK, for instance, there's this discourse around, class politics, which is obviously pervasive in the UK. And then that gets further broken down into thinking about the white working class being left behind. And that's not a place to build solidarity, socioeconomic solidarity, where actually you have not only shared concerns, but to talk about decoloniality, there's a shared history there. Colonialism was not only done, although disproportionately that colonialism was on the backs of slave labor, but it was also the blood, sweat, tear, and lives of disposable working class lives who staffed those factories on which that wealth was created for very little return. There is a solidarity there, just because the experience is not the same. So that when you ask that question about we, in my mind, it's genuinely everybody. But we have to rebuild our discourse to allow everybody in, and it is a challenge.
That would be a good challenge for the audience, to rebuild the discourse and the praxis of international solidarity. Lata, thank you very much for your passionate interventions on the way forward or the future of development in this fractured and polarized world. I would like to now invite Els Hertoge to come in, and we asked Els to attend the evening, to listen carefully, because she is going to work with all of you and many others on a new 5-year strategy and new plans for international solidarity for 11 and the whole North-South movement in Flanders. So we thought it would be good to get Els to reflect briefly on what was being discussed this evening. Els, on to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to close this evening debate, which is one of the many sessions of Forward Fest, as Guy told at the beginning. And the aim of Forward Fest is to inspire people by giving voice to people working inside and outside the sector of international solidarity. So we get inspired and triggered to rethink our agenda and rethink our way of working. From that point of view, I think this evening was very successful because I heard many insights that triggered me, and I will highlight some of them. Firstly, when I heard the discussion, the conversation with Ulrika, it was interesting to hear that UNDP makes the same analysis. It's not new, but we have to keep in mind as CSOs that it's important that as UNDP makes the same analysis, saying the narrative of the idea that growth has not given us, has not lived up to the expectations that we will not leave anyone behind, and that we have to set higher ambition and put people and planet first. It's very important to hear that UNDP has the same analysis as CSOs, and especially the fact that climate and environment is being put at the center is very interesting. In the afternoon, I heard Natalia Green speaking about the growing rights of nature movement. So it just inspires me, and it's very hopeful to see that within the multilateral organizations, but also in global CSO movement, we're really having the same agenda and putting climate environment at the center when we talk about humanity and human development. Secondly, what was really interesting, and that is that I also heard Ulrika saying that regarding defending ODA, she's really she's saying that we need to keep defending this. And for me personally, it's a very important point, because although ODA is just a small leverage for development, it's very important, especially in this Corona times. But then she also said that UNDP wants to show more boldness regarding the debt agenda and also the agenda of tax havens and tax evasion, challenging the World Bank and IMF. I think this is really important, and I definitely heard the appeal towards CSOs to keep pushing this agenda and also to keep stepping into discussions and dialogues being organized by the UN institutions. Then secondly, regarding the geopolitical trends, I found it very interesting to hear from Shada and Annelies that they're not so negative about the trends, that we also need to look at the positive things. For example, the fact that more countries within the UN are asking for more agency. For example, the G77, that are no more countries, but if they work together, that they can really shift the power in multilateral organizations. I find it very inspiring, especially when later on they talked about the crucial importance that, the crucial importance of civic space where CSOs can take up their role, can be critical. We have to keep on strengthening civil society worldwide to push their own government, but also to keep on taking those places in multilateral organizations. An organization as 1111 is really investing in this kind of cooperations. But I also learned from this discussion that there is no single narrative of the world. And this also challenges us as CSOs that we also may not think in one single narrative, not in black, white, good versus bad, but that we're constantly evolving, which means that we have to keep on making power analysis, keep to look for new alliances, and always challenge ourselves not to stand still, but to look for with whom we can step forward towards the agenda of putting people and planet first. And then lastly, it was really interesting and inspiring to hear Lata talking about the analysis on the growth paradigm so enthusiastically. The growth paradigm is problematic, and there's a huge task for global CSOs to connect and discuss such narratives. And which I find important is that in the beginning of the week, I had the opportunity to listen to Achille Mbembe, a thinker of the Global South, and he has a really clear idea of what this new narrative should be, how we should look at development. For him, we have to put the earth first, and we have to connect all living beings. But he also has very concrete and clear ideas on how, example, for Africa, we can develop in this way. And this challenges us, international CSOs, CSOs from the Global North, to share this knowledge more and to develop new narratives, new alternatives to this growth paradigm together, Global North and Global South. And when I look at the Global North, I see that there are a lot of young people are willing to make this analysis, to look for alternatives and solutions, but also when you refer to the discussions on decolonization, I think it's a huge opportunity to take up this discussion, because I think if we tackle this issue and really genuinely in an open way talk about it, we will find alliances, we will find each other, we will find common agendas, because when you look at global justice, the fact that people and planet should be put first, it's definitely an agenda that connects a lot of people. So I'm very much inspired this evening, and I see a lot of potential on developing a new agenda or an alternative agenda, but also finding new forms of building alliances and building power to change towards a more just world. So thanks for the inspiration, and hope to see a lot of people tomorrow and on the second day of Forward Fest.
I would like to thank everybody, especially he, for preparing this evening, and all of you for joining us. I think it was an intense debate. Sadly enough, we cannot go together now to the bar to have a pre-debate, and we will just have to leave this digital space. See you next time.